Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's letter to the Romans and chapter 1. Just in case you haven't had opportunity to hear the news over the last couple of weeks, let me tell you that there is a general election coming soon. And with the general election campaign well underway, the political parties are keen to make sure that their plans and policies are clear and convincing. They're doing their best to ensure that their message to the country sounds the best. And as you know, it's not just in politics that sort of things happens. It's a similar desire that drives the advertising industry. The retailers will pay the advertising companies millions to get the message across that their product, what they have on offer, is the best. And what happens in politics, what happens in advertising, also happens in religion. The various religions of this world are keen to portray their beliefs and their behaviour as being the most plausible and the most peaceable. They're desperate to make their views sound as if they are the most consistent and coherent that's available. They're doing all that they can to convince themselves and to convince others that their message is the best message that this world has ever heard. Wouldn't it be great, in the midst of all the political and philosophical and retailing and religious messages that are being communicated today, wouldn't it be great to know for certain that the message that you have heard and the message that you are believing and the message that you are trying to tell others about is indeed the best message that this world has and ever could hear? Well, that is precisely what the Apostle Paul believed. That's what he believed about his message. He believed that it was the best message that this world ever has and ever could possibly believe and hear. And in verses 14 to 20 of Romans chapter 1, he tells us why he believed that. And why many years later, you and I can continue to believe that. And the first thing we hear him saying as he does so is about our confidence in the gospel. Our confidence in the gospel. Now, as Paul begins his letter to the church in Rome, he wants the Christians there to know that he's eager to visit them. But did you notice there are some specific reasons why he's eager to visit them? And so verse 14, I am bound. Or perhaps better translated, I am a debtor, both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel to you who are at Rome. Now, there are two ways in which you can be a debtor. For example, if the person sitting to your left gives you a loan of £20, then you are a debtor to them and will remain so until you have repaid them the £20. That's one way in which you can be a debtor. But there's another way. Let's imagine the person sitting to your left gives you £20 for you to pass on to the person sitting to your right. Once again, you're a debtor. But this time you're a debtor to the person on your right. You have been entrusted with something for the purpose of passing it on, and until you do so, you are a debtor to the intended recipient. And that's how it is with me, says Paul. I am a debtor. Having been entrusted with the good news about Jesus Christ for the purpose of passing it on, this man considered himself to be in debt. He was indebted to the unbelieving people of this world. That is why I'm so eager to preach also to you who are at Rome. That was one reason why Paul was eager to go to Rome. But then there was another reason, and he tells us about that in verse 16, which, although not translated in the NIV, begins with the word for, and therefore provides another explanation to verse 15. I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome, for, or because, I am not ashamed of the gospel. I am not ashamed of the gospel. Now, don't forget, Rome was a big place in Paul's day. It still is a big place, but it was bigger back then. Not in terms of population, but in terms of significance. Rome was the capital of an empire which stretched all the way from North Africa to the north of England. And therefore, there were a lot of important people in Rome, doing a lot of important jobs and saying important things. If someone back then said they were going to Rome on business, then you can be sure it was pretty high-powered stuff. If there was anywhere in the world back then that you might be made to feel inferior or might be made to feel intimidated, it was Rome. And yet here is Paul, eager to bring the good news about Jesus Christ into a situation like that. And the reason I'm eager to do so, says Paul, is because I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, not even in Rome. Here is a man who has every confidence in the Christian gospel. Regardless of the political situation, regardless of the social classes, regardless of the cultural context, he has every confidence in the gospel. Don't you find that a challenge this morning? Don't you find as a Christian that your confidence in the gospel goes up and down depending on the person you're talking to or depending on the circumstances that they find themselves in? For example, tomorrow's Bank Holiday Monday, as you know. Let's imagine that you spend your Bank Holiday Monday travelling by car from here to the centre of London. What better way could you spend the Bank Holiday Monday? And as you've got plenty of time, you take the scenic route through the Cotswolds. Is anybody here from the Cotswolds? Oh, that was many years ago, John. It's changed since then. Okay, so I'm free to say what I'm going to say. I don't know if you've ever been to the Cotswolds, but I have. And although they don't have the mountains or lakes that we've got up here in North Wales, they do have some beautiful little villages and towns. Beautiful. And as you drive through one of those little villages, you think to yourself, wouldn't this be an ideal place for a church plant? After all, these people need to hear the gospel. And I've every confidence that the gospel could make some kind of impression in a situation like this. I can just picture a little local congregation growing steadily in a place like this. But then, sad to say, the Cotswolds don't last forever. And so within a couple of hours, you're hitting the outskirts of London and a place called Southall. Anybody here from Southall? Okay. I don't know if you've ever been to Southall, but I have. And as you drive through Southall, the horizon is dominated by minarets and mosques, Sikh temples, Hindu temples, and so on. And as you drive through Southall, does the thought of church planting enter your mind this time? Probably not. And the reason it doesn't is not because you don't think Southall needs the gospel as much as the Cotswolds do. It's because you don't have the same confidence that the gospel can address that situation and make an impression on that community. Next time you go to London, you go by train. A young man gets on at Colwyn Bay and sits beside you. You strike up a conversation with him and discover that he's unemployed, and he has been for some time. You continue the conversation, and it eventually provides a good opportunity for you to share the gospel. He gets off the train at Crewe. Another young man gets on and sits beside you. You strike up a conversation with him, and you soon discover that he's doing postdoctoral research in subatomic particle quantum equilibrium wave physics at Oxford University. Although you continue to chat about this, that, and a whole range of things, you never quite get round to sharing the gospel with that man for some reason. Don't you sometimes find yourself in situations where your confidence in the Christian gospel is not quite what Paul's was as he anticipated a visit to Rome? I do, and I suspect I'm not the only one. And so that being the case, we ought to ask Paul. We ought to ask him why he had such confidence in the gospel, which leads me to my second point, and that is the sufficiency of the gospel. The sufficiency of the gospel. Why is it, Paul, that you have such confidence in this gospel? Well, I'll tell you why, says Paul in verse 16. It's because the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. The city of Rome in those days was oozing with power. So much so, if you were playing a game of word associations back then, you know that game where you say something and the other person has to say something similar or connected or related in some way. If you were playing a game of word associations back then and the other person said Rome, your immediate response would have been emperor or power or something like that. But, says Paul, what you have to remember is that in the Christian gospel, there is a power which infinitely surpasses the power of Rome or the Roman Empire. Infinitely surpasses it. The gospel is the power of God. And therefore my message, says Paul, is infinitely more powerful. Can you grasp this for a minute? My message, says Paul, is infinitely more powerful than any law or edict which has crossed the lips of the emperor. Infinitely more powerful. In the gospel, there is divine power. Power to accomplish what no human emperor, what no US president, what no British prime minister or social media influencer or big celebrity could ever accomplish. And that is the eternal salvation of sinners. And if you want to know why this gospel possesses such power to save sinners, then read on into verse 16, because that is where he explains, for in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed. A righteousness from God. Now, when Paul speaks about a righteousness from God, which is revealed in the gospel and is by faith, he's referring to a righteous state or a righteous standing which God grants to people. Whereas we are by nature in the wrong with God. You know what it is to be in the wrong? You know what it is to be in the wrong with the law of the land, or in the wrong in respect to your parents, or in the wrong with respect to your school teacher or whatever? Well, by nature, we are in the wrong with God. But this is how, in the gospel, this is how God puts us in the right with himself. And what Paul says in verse 17 is that it is the Christian gospel which reveals how men and women can get in the right with God. It is the Christian gospel which reveals how men and women can have a right relationship with God. It is the gospel which tells us how we can have that righteous standing before God which we so desperately need. And one of the surprising things which this gospel reveals about this righteousness from God is that it is by faith. By faith. Many people today think that if they are going to get in the good books with God, then they will need to accomplish it by themselves, or at least contribute to it. And so they become more religious, or they try and become better people, or they try and become more environmentally friendly, or they try and become more spiritually aware or more socially acceptable, hoping that such improvements and such credentials will somehow get them in the right with God. But what Paul is saying in verse 17 is that this righteousness from God, this right standing with God, is not earned. It's not accomplished. It's not achieved by us trying to do anything. Instead, it is by faith. In other words, it is through freely receiving from God, through trusting what God has already done for us. It is something we receive from God through believing the good news about Jesus Christ. And that is why it is the good news about Jesus which has the power to save men and women and young people like you and me. It is by faith. It is in the gospel that such righteousness from God is revealed. There's no other religious message. There's no other philosophical argument. There's no other political manifesto, and we haven't even seen them yet. But I can say it, there will be no other political manifesto which provides an answer to the ancient question. You know what the ancient question is? It was asked by a man thousands of years ago. And that is, how can a man or woman be in the right with God? There's one for you to think about over lunch. How can a man or woman be in the right with God? None of the world's religions, none of the great philosophers of our day are able to answer that question. But the biblical gospel does answer that question. And therefore, if you believe the Bible's good news about Jesus, then what you will discover, as Paul says in verse 16, you will discover that the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. Believe the good news about Jesus Christ, and what you'll find is that it is a message which has not only informed your thinking, but has transformed your life, and more important still, has saved you from the frightening and eternal consequences of your sin. That is the power of the gospel to save us. That is the sufficiency of the Christian gospel to save us. And that is why Paul has every confidence in it as he anticipates his visit to Rome. And many years later, that is why you and I can continue to have every confidence in this good news about Jesus Christ. Confidence to believe it for ourselves, and confidence to share it with others. But that raises one more question. And that is, why do people need this righteousness from God that Paul is talking about here? Why do people need this salvation that Paul is talking about there? And therefore, why do people need this good news about Jesus? Why do I need it? Why do you need it? Why do the people that we meet from day to day need it in a society where people have so much and some appear to have everything? Why do they still need this gospel? Well, that leads me to my third and final point, and that is our desperate need of the gospel. Our desperate need of the gospel. Now, if you have an NIV, you'll notice that verse 18 appears to start a new paragraph. And not only a new paragraph, but verse 18 appears to start the start of a completely new section. Have you noticed that? That's how it appears in our English translations. But was that how Paul saw it? I'm not sure it was. And the reason I say that is because in more literal translations there is another for at the start of verse 18. A for which provides us with yet another vitally important link in the chain between what he has already been saying in verses 16 and 17 and what he's now going on to say in verse 18. And so rather than launching out on a completely new subject, Paul is continuing his argument. Do you remember what we've heard of the argument so far? The gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed. And why do people need this righteousness? Why do people need this salvation and therefore this gospel? For, verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Did you hear that? The reason we need to get into a right relationship with God, that right relationship which the Christian gospel tells us about and which the Christian gospel provides us with, the reason we need to get into that right relationship with God and need to do so desperately is because of God's wrath. That's what Paul's saying. God is angry with us. And the reason he is angry is because our godless way of life is not something that we've done in ignorance. No, it is something we have done knowingly. In living a godless life, we have been deliberately suppressing what we know to be the truth about God. Oh yes, you know the truth about God. Through the creation of this universe, God's existence and something of God's character have been clearly seen, have been plainly revealed, so much so, says Paul in verse 20, that when it comes to the subject of God, men and women are without an excuse. Without an excuse. That is true whether we live in beautiful North Wales, or the Cotswolds, or Southall, or Slovakia. Men and women are without excuse. And yet, rather than responding to the revelation of God in creation as we ought to have done, we have suppressed what we know to be the truth about God and have instead given our worship and our allegiance to a variety of other man-made things. We've worshipped created things rather than the Creator. And far from being indifferent to what we have done, far from turning a blind eye to it, God is angry with us. He is angry with us in the present. Did you notice that? The wrath of God is presently being revealed. He is angry with us in the present, and if we continue as we are, we will experience his wrath in a much fuller way on a future and final day of judgment. That's the frightening predicament that we are in as human beings. And that's why we desperately need to hear and believe the good news about Jesus. We need to believe the good news about Jesus because what that good news tells us, and if you're not sure why it's good news, listen to this. What that good news tells us is that in his death upon the cross, Jesus was experiencing God's wrath in the place of sinful people like you and me. And through relying completely on what Jesus has done, you and I can be rescued from God's wrath. Isn't that tremendous? You and I can be rescued from God's wrath and brought into a right rather than a wrathful relationship with him. And so if you've never put your trust and your confidence in Jesus Christ for your forgiveness and for your salvation, then that is what you desperately need to do now. You desperately need to do that, because it is only through trusting in Jesus' wrath-quenching death on the cross that you and I can be delivered from God's wrath. Delivered from it in the present, and rescued from a fuller and final expression of it in the future. Because of God's wrath, you desperately need to believe the good news about Jesus. And if you are already trusting in Jesus Christ, then don't forget that it's because of God's wrath that the people round about you desperately need to hear the good news about Jesus. It's not just that they're living lives that are not quite 100% satisfactory. It's not just that they're living lives that haven't quite reached their full fulfillment or their full potential. Yes, there is an element of that, and there's an aspect in which that is true. But the reason they desperately need to hear the gospel is because of something much bigger and greater and more important and more frightening than that. It's because of God's wrath that they desperately need to hear it. They desperately need to hear it regardless of their ethnic background, regardless of their social status, regardless of their academic achievements, regardless of how popular they may be on social media. None of those things make a man or a woman exempt from the wrath of God, as Paul makes clear in verses 18 to 20. And therefore, regardless of those things, the people around you desperately need that salvation and that right standing with God that Paul has spoken about in verses 16 and 17. And therefore they desperately need to hear our gospel. That gospel that you and I can have every confidence in. And the reason you can have every confidence in sharing this gospel with others is twofold. Firstly, because as we've seen already, this gospel, it is sufficient to meet their greatest need. It is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. And secondly, you can share it with confidence because there's nothing other than this gospel that can meet their greatest need. Nothing. No amount of financial clout. No amount of social kudos, no amount of academic success can ever deliver them from the wrath of God. But here's the thing. Your Saviour and his gospel can. And therefore we can offer it to them with confidence. Knowing with confidence that it is the best news they could ever possibly hear. Just as Paul could go to Rome with every confidence in the gospel, so you and I can reach out to members of our family, to the people of our locality, to the students of our university, and to the students of Slovakia with every confidence in this gospel, for the simple reason that this gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. May God help each one of us to believe it, and then to share it. We're going to sing in closing.